Hi, welcome to this tutorial that will show you how to implement the spellcasting system within your project. I'm going to be using one of the templates that come with the Unreal Engine, but the methodology should be exactly the same to add it to your own project. So what we're going to do first is create our project. So let's do it in third person. We're going to name our project. Once we have created our project, we're gonna add the spell system content from the marketplace to our project. This is done via the launcher. First, we're gonna wait for the editor to load. I'm gonna close down the editor. Go to our launcher and add the system to the project. Select our project, and that's it for this. So we're gonna open our project. And the first thing we're gonna do, making sure that the content is actually there, we are gonna find our pawn blueprint, which in this case is in blueprints my character. And first thing we're gonna do is add a new variable. I'm gonna call it spell system. Variable type needs to be an object reference to spell system. If it doesn't show up straight away, you may need to open the blueprint so that the editor knows it's there. Maybe even recompile. Okay. Now there you go. Spell system. Object reference. Now what we're gonna do, once we have done this, is we're gonna go ahead and go into the construction script of our pawn. And we're gonna create an action instance. Now what we're gonna do is get our spell system. Set our spell system. We're gonna get the return value from the action instance node, and we are gonna cast it to spell system. And on successful cast, we're gonna set spell system to be equal to that. Okay, next what we're gonna do is go back to our event graph, and on event begin play, we're gonna get our spell system and call the setup function. What this does is it spawns the spell database within the game world, so we have reference for all the spells. Now what we're gonna do is get event tick, and on event tick we're gonna call the tick function of the spell system. This handles the casting and the cooldowns. So if this isn't done, most likely your cooldowns will not work. It's also while we are here, we can also set up events for selecting next and previous spells. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna use a mouse wheel for this example. You have mouse wheel up for selecting your next spell. Select next. And we're gonna have mouse wheel down for selecting previous spell. Oops. Now that we have done this, what we need to do is we need to create our spell, or you can use the fireball spell that's already provided with the system. If you want to create your own spell, you create a child of spell base. And give it your own name. So in this case, and you open your blueprint and you go to the defaults, and here you can set the base values for the spell. The blueprint actually handles more of the projectile of the spell, so it doesn't have to be a projectile, but in case you wanted to create an instant cast spell or a channeled spell, then the channel spell, for example, could be done as a multiple projectiles being casted once every second for a certain period of time. And instant cast spells would have a projectile speed. It wouldn't really matter, because what you do is you set the logic of the spell within the take function or even the cast function of the spell, which means that these could be irrelevant, meaning that you would not need to worry about your spell being a projectile or having a speed, or in some cases even a cohesion effect or such. You don't need to specify spell mesh, but if you do, it will be visible within the game. Spell effect particle is visible from the moment you start casting to the point where the spell collides or ends or hits the enemy. So in this case, we're gonna use, for example, fire. So basically, it's a fire. Collision size. Now that is important for particle spells or any spells that don't have a set target. Basically, the spell by default has a sphere collision, and the collision size is the size of this collision sphere. So in this case, we're gonna go with 32, which is roughly the size of a football. We're not gonna bother setting a spell mesh. We can set a spell sound if we want, but don't have to. And we can set a collision effect, but we don't have to do that either. Collision effect is when the spell collides with something, so explosion, for example. I'm gonna set a projectile speed in this case because the tutorial spell will be a projectile. Now we're gonna save this and close it down. We're gonna go to spell system, spell database, and here we are going to add a new spell. There's by default there is a sample fireball spell. What we're gonna do is add a new spell, and we're gonna set a name for our spell, description, hour. These values are values that you can get when the spell hits to handle how you want to handle damage and so on. Mana would generally mean a cost of the spell, but since the system itself does not handle mana costs, that is something you have to handle just as you cast the spell. So here the mana value is something that you can get when you cast the spell. You can get it. You can check prior to the cast if the player has enough mana and such. Cooldown of the spell, that is in seconds. Basically, once the spell is cast, it is set automatically with the whole cooldown, and the cooldowns are handled by the spell system. Same with the cast time. In this case, we're gonna set cast to 1 second, and we're gonna set cooldown to 5 seconds. The type and such has no effect on the spell whatsoever. It's just a value for you to deal with. For example, because you can, on collision, you can get you can basically get this struct for the spell. So you can get the spell name, mana cost, the power of it, the type of the spell, and so on. So within your pawns that generally get affected by these spells, you would be handling what you do depending on the spell type. But that is something you handle within your pawn. That is not something that the spell system handles. And you can set a spell particle blueprint, which is the visual representation of the spell. We're going to set it to the tutorial spell, which we created earlier. And we can set an animation. Animation has to be a montage, and it will only play if it's compatible with the mesh that you specify upon cast. And we can also set a lifespan of the spell, which is after the spell has been casted, how long does it remain in the world. Of course, collision does destroy the spell, but let's say we were casting a spell into the sky, we would not want the spell to indefinitely be flying. That would be just another object within the game world. So we can set a lifespan in seconds again. So in this case, we're going to set it 20 seconds. This can be effectively used to limit range of particles. Because we can limit the range of the spells, of particle spells, projectile spells. Where once we cast the spell, it will be only in the world for 20 seconds. If it hits something prior to that, then it will do whatever you program it to do. If it doesn't, then after 20 seconds it gets automatically distracted. What we should note is the ID of the spell as well. In this case it's 1. We can compile the spell database and close it down. We're gonna go back to our pawn, and in our pawn, on event begin play, we're gonna get add spell to the spell system. And in this case, we're gonna add the ID of the spell that we just created to make it available to this particular pawn. So we add a spell of ID 1, the one we just created. And yeah, we also probably should set the current spell. Otherwise, by default, the current spell is always the first spell that is added to the character. So in this case, the spell, it will be this spell. But if we had multiple spells, then maybe we would want to set the default active spell that will be casted. Also, what we need to do is we need to create our event for actually casting a spell. So in this case, we're gonna use left mouse button, and on pressed, we're gonna get our spell system, and we're gonna call cast function. What the cast function does is it casts the currently selected spell, which by default is the first spell added to the pawn, and can be changed either by calling the select next or select previous, or we can directly call set current spell. If we wanted to check if the player had enough mana for a spell, what we would do is, instead of getting prior to casting, what we would do is get current spell is a function, and it returns a spell struct. What we do is break the spell struct, get the spell cost, which is in this case mana, and you would compare it to your character's mana variable, if you have one. Okay, so once we are here, what we need to do, we need to set a caster for the spell. So in this case, that would be self as the pawn that has initiated the cast. we need to set a custom mesh, which is the mesh that gets animated when the spell is being cast. So in this case, we would get the character mesh. We need to set a cast rotation, which this is more of a, like, if you had a spell, for example, which would go sort of up and then down from above, you may want to set the cast rotation to a custom value. While in this case, we're gonna be wanting to cast the spell in whatever direction the character is facing, so you're gonna get actor rotation, which is this actor, which is the pawn that initiates the cast. Cast position offset. By default, the spell gets spawned on the point where basically on the location of the actor that initiates the cast. You may want to set an offset. So for example, for the third person template, there will be a Z offset, so it casts slightly higher around the arm's height. Something around the value of 20, because by default it will cast exactly at the position of the actor, so you must cast it slightly higher. You can also specify spell target, which is the target of the spell. So if you specify a spell target, the spell will automatically guide itself towards that target. Once the cast function gets called, it returns a success bool. This bool represents if the spell has successfully begun casting, and it returns the spell that has begun casting as well. So at this point, you could check, have I begun casting the spell, and do whatever logic you want to do or need to do within your own game. I can also, of course, get the spell has been casted. Such. That's all for this part of the tutorial. Of course, there'll be coming up tutorials on how to deal with creating a certain types of spells and how to handle damage and so on. So unless I've done something wrong, I should be able to and have access to the spell. Unless I've done something wrong, which in this case it seems that I have. I'm gonna try this again. That is odd. We're getting a error. I see. It seems he doesn't like this, so we're gonna create a create action instance. Set spell system. Alright, there we go. So as you can see, spell gets spawned exactly where the character is, and it flies in whatever direction the character is facing. It has the set speed that we set it, and it has a cooldown, so once we cast it, we can cast it for a couple more seconds. Once the cooldown has expired, we can cast it again. And on collision we can see the spell explodes, and that's it for this tutorial. Hope it was helpful. Any questions, you can use the details provided on the Unreal Marketplace to contact me directly. If you have any custom requests, either for tutorials or for a function you would like to see within the system, then let me know and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. Thanks for watching.